good, constructive conversations that you've found people to ideate with and to, you know, be inspired by. And that you too are also sharing your best and big ideas with everyone, you know, at the conference. I think that's really what GDN has been about for me, and I hope it's the same for you. A question of collaboration, sharing knowledge, and building capacity so that we can support all learners worldwide, whether in post-secondary education or their careers and their other needs throughout their lives. So I hope that you found the conversations constructive. This morning, we're going to be talking about, we'll have a panel on quality assurance frameworks in one country. And because essentially this feeds into this notion of fair recognition and trusted assessment mechanisms and techniques, we are going to start the morning by presenting one of our patrons, a certificate to one of our patrons. And this patron represents a wonderful organization responsible for quality assessments and fair recognition for learners prior education. And so I would like to welcome Jelger de Boer up to the stage, president of the GDN, to make this presentation.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hope this is working. I wasn't mic'd up, but that's okay. This is just an opportunity to honor one of our patrons. I've talked a little bit yesterday about how important they are for us as an organization, because it means continued support, both in spirit but also financially, which is very important for us to make sure that we can provide you with a conference experience like we are doing this week. So I would love to invite Margit up to the stage. I think you are almost ready to retire, right? Aren't you?
That is true.
That is true. So I'm happy that I'm able to present you with this certificate for ECE, for your continued support in the past and in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Can I just say one thing?
Yes, of course.
It's very important for ECE to support the GDN and all that it does. And I, on a personal note, want to say that I was at the original GDN signing back when GDN started. I'm wondering if anyone else in the audience was there. There we go. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Smile away. There we go.
And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome the first panel, which is actually regarding the quality assurance framework here in Canada, over there in Canada. And I welcome my colleagues to the stage to begin the panel discussion. So now over to you, Michael, to introduce yourself.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Groningen, and I am the coordinator of the Canadian Information Centre for International Credentials. So we are the Information Centre for Canada under the UNESCO conventions.
People know me, but they don't know the hat I wear in this space, so I'll introduce myself from that point of view. I am a former registrar, assistant vice president, and I've also have several decades doing the work of credential evaluation and or helping to train and build standards across the world in the area of recognition. I've had the wonderful pleasure to help Michael with the quality assurance framework, as well as working with CICIC and CMEC to help the regulatory teachers' bodies across the country as it relates to understanding the Lisbon Recognition Convention, the Global Convention, and what that means to credential assessment and so on. So we'll be talking about some of that in a minute.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here. My name is Beka Tavart-Kiladze. I'm a Senior Director for Global Education and Knowledge at World Education Services, a patron organization. I've been in the field of credential evaluation since 2000, recognition since 2002. In both countries, I have worked for WES in our US office for about 9 years and then moved to Canada. I have a good understanding of what works in US, what doesn't work in Canada, or vice versa. So it's an interesting perspective that we'll share today.
Hi, everyone. You know that I'm Kathleen Massey. Aside from my affiliation with GDN, I'm the Vice Provost Students at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada, which I described as here earlier, but is really over there. I wanted to say that what I bring to this conversation is many years of practice, essentially, applying the understanding of the conventions. I'm also a member of the national committee that Michael oversees to update the standards in Canada for international credential evaluation and assessment. So, but in practice, I have had for many years admission teams report to me both for undergraduate and graduate students, and so that's the lens through which I'll be discussing my contribution today. Back to you, Michael.
Perfect. So I think first off, it's good to bring us up to the macro level to look at how different things have an impact on quality assurance. So the first one, of course, we've heard the key word yesterday. Quality assurance is quite central to our field and our organizations. It's a tool, a mechanism that can build that trust into our process and how we do things, so that other organizations view our work and accept what we do as a trusted output. And so that whole concept of quality assurance, I think, is quite important in everything that we do, and we should be mindful of that, both internally within our organization, but also externally. The other element that yesterday, of course, we talked about technology, how it keeps evolving, changing. This has a huge impact on our field of work in assessment and credential recognition. To some capacity, some organizations it's easier for them to follow and be innovative, but for other organizations, it can also be quite challenging to keep up with all these changes. And it brings back to the concept of change management, again mentioned yesterday. All this innovation and putting in place new practices will involve change management. In our field especially, credential evaluators have relied heavily on a paper-based process. And for them, feeling the documents, seeing it in physically, it was quite important. And so when we change the process to have this all digital, it brings about a big change and for the work of our credential evaluators and the users of those reports. The other element that's quite important is the treaties. And of course, we have UNESCO that has put in place very important conventions that set some principles that all our organizations that do this work can abide by and guide their work. Of course, the Global Convention is the newest tool that we have that all the countries are able to ratify. And so this is a new framework that's available for all the countries. On the Global Convention, I'm happy that Canada is making progress on the Global Convention for ratification. We're not there yet, but we're getting closer. And for the Lisbon Convention, which is the countries in the European area and North America, Canada has ratified that convention. So those treaties are quite important. We also note on digitization, we have recently UNESCO that introduced a recommendation on AI. So this is a new development that we should be mindful of, as well as the Council of Europe that just have launched their new convention on AI. So this is actually a convention that's legally binding. So we should watch those space to see how this evolves. Now, to bring us back to the sector, so in terms of our credential assessment sector, in the ENIC-NARIC network, we have the network of all the information center that collaborate. And we've worked on many tools and projects and resources that have been developed around digitization, quality assurance. So we can look at those tools and inspire ourselves from what has been developed by these networks. In Canada, we've participated to some of those projects, and we've used some of those outputs to influence our work. More specifically, for Canada, because we ratified a convention, education is a provincial responsibility in Canada, it's not federal. So this means that we have a very decentralized approach to implement the convention. And so for us, it was important to try to have certain principles that we could abide by and that the sector in Canada could implement to help their work on credential assessment. And so this was the inception in the 90s of what we call now the quality assurance framework. So that framework has evolved through time. We just did a revision, and Joanne was very graceful to help with her expertise to help us push the digitization aspect. And so the new framework has been approved earlier this year, and it includes a bit more principles around digitization and the exchange of data. So that was a very good development, and we're very happy to see that. And so the QAF is an evergreen document. It keeps evolving. So we need to make sure that it keeps up with what's happening in our field, how we can respond to changes. And so we plan those regular update cycles. So this is something that's quite important.
May I just make a comment around that? One thing, when he uses the phrase QAF, Quality Assurance Framework, it's not like what you saw for South Africa yesterday, where it's mapping the credentials, et cetera. It really is about how to do the assessment practice. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. And I also want to flag for you that in your CVent, there is a resource document, which Michael kindly put together, which we'll use as a tool to continue to build on, with links to a lot of what he's talking about. And so you can actually go into it for this session under the resources section, in case while we're speaking, you wanted to highlight something or speak to something as we're going along.
And the other element that I wanted to raise is how in Canada we've tried to implement those things. So I'll give a concrete example. We have, back in the 90s, again, our government, when we tried to implement the conventions, we needed to set up services that would do credential assessments. And so those services, we needed to find a way that they would align around certain principles. And so the QAF is that document that aligns our principles. And so on a cyclical basis, the members of the Alliance need to demonstrate that they adhere to those principles and they comply on a regular basis through a peer review. And so we have a peer review process that's in place. We're just starting off our 2-year cycle with another peer review, which will be completed earlier next year. And so that's one way of trying to see if the policy is being implemented on the ground effectively, and they are, I guess, responding to the needs of the conventions, which we need to abide by for Canada, of course. The other element, of course, is our national center ourselves. So we are, of course, a national information center that is with peers. We have other centers that are here in the room today and probably online. And there is a process where we can peer review ourselves. And so we just completed our own peer review for Canada. We had the colleagues from the Information Center from the Netherlands and Italy that came to Canada, and a member of the Alliance that I mentioned. So they peer review our process, our procedures, and our planning as well, how we plan to do some work, advance some work in the next few years as well. So I think this whole quality assurance piece is quite critical and quite important to review what we're doing and adjust and respond to our peers, how they view our work and how we can improve continually.
May I ask, who are the members of the Alliance? Because I'm not sure everybody here knows that term and so on.
So in Canada, we have 6 services that have been mandated by our provinces. So in Quebec, it's within the Ministry of Immigration. It's a public entity. In Alberta, it's within the government as well, another public entity. In British Columbia, we have a service in a polytechnic. At the University of Toronto, we have another service as well. And we have 2 private members. World Education Service is one of those, and ICAS in Ontario as well. So we have 6 members, a mix of private and public services.
I think that's a beautiful segue for you.
Thank you. Excellent points that Michael raised. Quality assurance framework has been a bedrock for processes at WES to adhere to quality assurance frameworks and how it evolved. But before I get to how it evolved, I want to bring up something. When we work, organizations also have business demands that necessitate some of the innovation and processes. So when we talk about the topic is digital document exchange, I'm proud to represent an organization that started receiving digital data from CGDCD, as it was called back then, I believe in 2009. It was one of the first practices, I would say, in North America, definitely in Canada, where we started receiving documents and student data in a digital form. And to Michael's point, there's a reason why I mentioned I've been in the field since 2002, not to date myself, but we were raised in the environment, and I think we're still kind of coming out of it in a way that if I don't have the document in front of me, if I don't smell it, and we used, some of you probably remember that we used to smell an Eastern European document because it was X, Y, and Z, and it smelled new, but it was issued in '86. What a hilarious! So those types of kind of.
I didn't know you did that.
We did that.
I like to learn something new every day.
We used to do that.
Wow.
But joking aside, I think it speaks to trust, as a lot of the
Smell test,
right? a lot of the discussions that we're having today and yesterday, it's all about trust. Once you establish that trust, then things take a life of its own and things become easier. So, for example, I wanna kind of keep at that point innovation in terms of student data exchange. Once we were able to do that and received the documents, then we also realized that number of our applicants, they would have to spend, for example, just bringing it kind of on a practical matter, spend a lot of money to go back and order that transcript to be sent to, I don't know, 7 or 5 universities where that's how they accepted the documents. That's how that was mandated by the school. And imagine the cost, right? Go request a document and send it in a mail, DHL, FedEx, they're very expensive. So what we realized that we could help applicants even more. So because of the trust, we created something called a package, Advantage package at WES, where once we would verify the document, we could transmit this to another entity, another recipient, 5 recipients for one cost. So it limited the cost and a cost exposure for applicant. Of course, it was trust, organizations trusted WES. There were some that didn't, of course, but we started that and it started to take off and it helped thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of applicants to save cost. Another point that I would also raise is, and as I mentioned in the beginning, kind of 2 perspectives in terms of US and Canada. Treaties are extremely important, as Michael mentioned, and Lisbon Recognition Convention and hopefully Global Recognition Convention will take it further. LRC has been a game changer for us, for the work that WES has been able to spearhead in a way in our community, credential qualification recognition, work with refugees. When we started working with refugees after the Syrian crisis hit, and eventually in 2019, the ILRC got ratified, it gave more teeth to our argument to a regulatory body or to an academic institution that this is an international legal agreement that the country has accepted and has an obligation to have processes in place to have qualification recognition for refugees. Some organizations, of course, develop their own mechanisms. Some organizations, they used WES and used other organizations, part of the alliance, to mitigate the risk. And well, I adhere to the Lisbon Recognition Convention by using ICAS, WES, IQUAS, MIDI. So it is important. I think what I'm trying to say is treaties are important to build on, but also, as Michael mentioned, quality assurance framework, pan-Canadian quality assurance framework. I remember started working on this in 2009 when I moved to Canada, and it's continuously evolving, but we as business and independent organizations and governmental organizations are pushing the envelope. And same thing happened, one more point that I'll make, same thing happened, 2020 necessitated the update in terms of the revision for the quality assurance framework in pan-Canadian, because everybody started to become familiar with document exchange. There was no other way, mail. Where I have some of my colleagues that we remember how difficult it was to receive a document when borders were closed. So it changed the mindset. Environment forced us to. I don't know if we would have that level of trust without COVID. I call it benefit of COVID, forgive me. Please.
So I just want to sort of interject here and give a little flavor on the Canadian context. And you heard some of this earlier in the week where Kathleen talked about 13 provinces and territories. So Michael has talked about how there's this alliance. There are very specific organizations that are part of that alliance, and his center is part of the ENIC-NARIC Center. There are hundreds of post-secondary institutions and organizations, including the IB, et cetera, that provide post-secondary level type training, and they are not, because of our governance, part of the alliance. And in fact, they take their leadership legally from either the province directly by virtue of an act or some kind of, and the act could even be at the institution level. It's not necessarily, in some instances it's not, it's across a whole sector. So there's a huge variety of education ministries in Canada, over 20 in fact. And so there's no central authority. So how does a body like Michael's, with no legislative authority, convince all these schools or even make them aware of the LRC? And so in the, gosh, it must have been in the 90s, your predecessor, maybe it was early 2000s, I don't remember her name. Natasha, thank you. She and I connected at, I remember, a CAPLA conference, I think it was, and that's also where I first met Michael. And at the time, I was president of the National Registrars Association. And we started talking because they wanted to figure out a way to bring in the registrarial community that is so integral to document credential assessment across the country. And that's, I think, where the journey started. And then you started to create that national advisory group, et cetera. But technically, there is absolutely no legislation, even though our federal government has ratified the LRC, there's no legislation provincially that mandates institutions and other bodies outside the alliance to do this work. So really, it's been about raising awareness, persuading, training, teaching, engaging informally with institutions, but also formally to help them understand what these instruments are. And that work, I would say, continues to the day.
And I'll add that for the professional regulatory bodies, so the whole question of the professions, we've seen something very interesting happen in Canada where some provinces over time decided to introduce legislation to ensure that there was a fair process in place by those regulators that would be transparent, timely, based on a procedure that's very transparent, in fact, and based on the convention. So this was a very interesting development on the professional regulatory side, where there's actually an act. Now in Canada, on the 10 provinces, there's 9 that have introduced such legislation. So we're very happy to see that. So this means that in each of those provinces, there is a provincial official that's charged with overseeing the act and making sure that those regulators are, in fact, applying fair principles.
And I'd be interested from a school point of view. I mean, you're not legislated to follow any of this, so why do you do it? How do you do it?
Right. So, yeah, so because we're not required to do this, it's very easy to just choose not to, you know. But we've talked a lot during this meeting so far, this conference, about the importance of trust. Building trust includes developing, or not developing, but sharing in adopting procedures, practices, principles that are anchored in UNESCO's conventions, so that we can say in our respective institutions where we manage this individually. We actually do our own, my team does its own assessment of international credentials, of refugee credentials, and so on. We don't require students to have an assessment done outside the institution. So you can imagine they not only need to know how to interpret the various education systems across the world, but they need to be able to, and this is my first point that hasn't been mentioned, they need to be able to do it in such a way that they understand that their work is being done in context, in a global context, where there are principles and best practices and conventions. It's very easy as an admissions professional to just simply think very locally, almost hyper-locally, and apply your own, oh, this would be easier if I did this way or whatever. But what we want to do is build trust that we are going to be fair and that we are going to evaluate these documents, students' documents, accurately and without, and here's my second point, aside from having a community of practice and convention framework, mitigating bias, right? I want my team, as they are reviewing, and my registrar to lead in this way, reviewing credentials, reviewing qualifications, reviewing transcripts, and parking their bias by adopting standards and best practices that have been, established at the global level and thought through in a very deliberate, comprehensive way. So it's, again, very easy for local and hyperlocal teams to assess someone's credentials, thinking, oh, and that education might be X or this education might be Y, and it's not based in fact. So in order to be trusted, we need to ensure that our teams, and I do this, ensure that our teams understand that there are ways to mitigate their own biases. The third thing is, in terms of practice, we were being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of requests for evaluations, but I believe it's very important for a segment of my team to have the expertise to know how to fairly evaluate and assess credentials from around the world. So, but the volume was incredible. So, Charmaine Hack, Joanne Duclas, and I thought it would be important to adopt MyCreds, which you heard about earlier. It came to be known as MyCreds, but the concept was to have more digitized credentials, information shared with us so that we could expedite the receipt of those documents. If you can imagine, and I'm sure you can, in the days, as Becca mentioned, when it was all paper, I had a whole team in the back office.
Document processing.
Called document processing or whatever we called it, but opening massive envelopes of documents and putting them into some kind of condition so that admission officers could evaluate them, smell them, touch them, look at the spelling on each document to make sure that biology wasn't written as Boyle or that the signatures were right. So we had to use all sorts of databases to validate the authenticity of documents. So digitization has removed a lot of that busy work and has allowed us to do a much more effective job of receiving authentic documents and then being able to spend our time doing a quality assessment. And I should say our time, I mean my team's time. They do a fantastic job with this. But I think, at the end of the day, this is why the QAF has been so helpful to us, because it distills all the inputs from around the world, from the ENIC-NARICs, from the, UNESCO, from the, and from various other organizations in terms of best practice around the world to help us understand how we can train our teams. So I'm very much enthusiastic about this idea of adoption of the QAF, the framework, the quality assurance framework at the local level.
So there is another piece to this that fascinates me, and I just want to do a call out to the audience. How many of you are faculty members? And how many of you sit on the policy bodies at your institutions? Okay. So one of the things I think would be interesting for the GDN is to bring in more faculty colleagues such as yourself. The reason is because there's also a need for certain policies to be created at the institutional level, depending on how your governance is. In universities in Canada, a lot of them follow what's called a bicameral system. Not always, but it's usually bicameral, where the board looks after the business type stuff, but then there's academic colleagues that are setting all the academic policies, the admissions policies and the like. And it might be like that at your organization as well, your institution. So I remember in the early 90s, we had a series of admissions requirements. We actually looked at them and they were very, shall we say, they needed to be brought forward. They were somewhat colonial and they had some lenses on certain parts of the world that maybe weren't the best. So we had to take it forward en masse for change in keeping with the work of actually the Lisbon Recognition Convention. We had a vice president academic, Sheila Embleton, who brought the voice of the LRC to my institution 30-some years ago when it first came out. And so we brought that whole policy framework up. And so when we think about, we're here talking about digital innovation, recognition, and so on, but the reality is in Canada, a lot of our institutions at the micro level policy-wise are setting direction on this kind of thing. And so helping them evolve there is a big, tall task. And I would imagine it's the same in other places. I don't think we're unique in that regard. But it's important because we had to ensure that it was respectful recognition was occurring even during the admission process. And then once you get that landed, then you can start looking at things like what is the systems and the processes and practices that need to be put in place and where digital can make change and help to make it happen. But even in the present day, here we've gone and put in this national ecosystem. And I will tell you that I hear still from recognition colleagues who maybe aren't as aware of what all of you are doing, who think that, well, if it's not coming from that direct digital repository to me, so I'll use a hypothetical example, all the way from CSSD to me, or if it's not coming direct from my equals to me as a credential evaluator, let's say it comes through my creds, then they're hesitant to accept it because it's not coming direct. And yet they should, because actually the way the infrastructure and technology is set up, it's coming direct from source and it's the most current direct from source. The CSD arrangement is a little bit different and it has some nuance to it, but there's some education even today that we need to help our communities in the credential evaluation world, because it's not all done by the evaluation companies. Sometimes there's teams in-house, and that this is the way to build it. And I just want to do a shout out for CICIC. CICIC is a really important organization. And it's new, relatively new. And Margit can speak to it better than I can, but I will say the first time I attended a CICIC, which is credential evaluators from around the world coming together to help learn and grow, much like the ENIC-NARIC meetings, another great venue for learning, for recognition and sharing. I felt like I'd come home because finally I was with people who this was their jam. So it was really quite exciting. It's quite how I feel here, actually. But there's work there, and I look forward from the GDN point of view, but also from the Canadian point of view, what more can we be doing with organizations like that so that we can help educate people about what we do from a digital kind of perspective and also get their input. You know, and I'll just tell one more story. A certain region of the world has innovated verifiable credentials. Very cool. This is how they're transmitting their academic results through to credential evaluators, et cetera. But I learned a story from a credential evaluator as part of one of my research projects who said, you know, it was difficult to download and consume. It didn't have the complete information I needed. It didn't come in a format that I could actually use so that I could verify X, Y, Z. Ergo, I still had to get another original from the candidate so that I could create a complete package for the end employer, or I can't remember what it was, the end user that they were doing this evaluation work for. So these are some of the challenges that exist today still. And we joke about smelling the paper and the document, et cetera. I guarantee you there are many institutions that are still taking in documents because there are parts of the world where it's not digitized and they have to. And so, and to try and get documents from that part of the world might be really tough for the learner and for the institution. So we still have the tall challenges from a recognition and quality point of view and trust building point of view. The work is not done, but it's just remarkable to me how far we've come, but there's still so much more we even need to do in our own Canadian reality as we continue to build this out. And I hope you don't mind me saying that. I know there's wonderful work going on, but it's always what more, what more, what more. You might have some comments on that.
No, I think you're right. These things take time to change, and there's the change management aspect again that we need to reinforce with the teams and the organizations that are taking care of these procedures to continually evolve, change our practices, improve, and increase digitization, which is, we can't avoid it. This is how the new generation as well wants to consume the information. They need access quickly, reliably, and they rely on these organizations to change, to implement this.
And I will say there's another point I want to make. When I was doing the work with the teaching regulatory bodies, and you look at the LRC and the Global Convention, which tries to encourage an outcomes-oriented focus, this notion of having to count credits to a very specified level is deeply embedded in some legal regulatory frameworks, even in our country. And so they can't even use digital. In some instances, they will insist on print, like a paper copy, because that's baked into, I've heard that in some of the American contexts as well. So there's a lot more work to do, and it's very hard to crack open a government act and make this kind of change. And so at the leadership policy level and governance level, we still have some work to do as a country, and at the regulatory body level, we do as well. And I can't imagine, I mean, are we, is other people the same? Please raise your hand. Do you have the same context that I've described? Nobody? Some of you? Well, then we seem very unique because there's not too many hands that have gone up, so I'll pause there.
It's probably time that we wrap. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind the bigger picture, the frameworks that I mentioned earlier, and then all the way down to the organization level. How can we, as leaders in our own organizations, influence and improve the situation around digitization and those quality assurance procedures that we can build on to build that trust and make sure that the work that we do is valuable and accepted. Ultimately, we want the end user to use the output that we're producing, of course.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for attending this session, and we're going to transition right into the next session momentarily. Thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you.
If you want to just stand up and stretch for a moment, you're welcome to do that.